In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about roles and processes in schools. Now, what that means is it's about the systems and what happens within schools that can affect a student's achievement as well as their experience of education as a whole. And we're going to talk about the ideal pupil. We're going to bring in labelling theory, which you'll remember from doing perspectives. We're going to look at groupings in schools and how both labelling and grouping within schools can affect the achievement and experience a student has within the education system. Now, for this lecture, there are a number of studies that we will be looking at. And although you don't need to know the years in which they were done, it's helpful to, but you do need to know who did it, what they did, and what they found out for those studies. And this can be used as application in any exam question or essay that you write. So we're going to start talking first of all looking at labelling. Now, labelling is very much an unconscious process within schools. And what I mean by that is that it's not something that is necessarily discussed or determined. There's no formal attachment of labels. It's not like the sorting hat in Harry Potter, where you're put into your different houses and those different houses have certain attributes. It's more a way of a teacher to understand the class that's in front of them. So you've got a class of 30, and this labelling process allows a teacher to understand who is in front of them so that they're able to shape their teaching to that class, which is quite a positive way of looking at labelling. There is a negative side to it as well, which can lead to students being anti-school and things like that. So a label can be attached, a negative label can be attached, and because of the treatment due to that label, it can lead to negative outcomes such as poor academic achievement, poor behaviour, or a negative experience of education for the student. There are a number of different factors which play into the attachment of a label. So it's not just one thing that says, oh, you're like that then. It's a combination of both attributes and personalities and information that can create that label. So the first one we're going to discuss is gender. And this links very closely into the gender role socialization idea, and that girls and boys are socialized differently. Girls are socialized often into what's referred to as the bedroom culture. And the bedroom culture is this idea that girls are protected, they're kept indoors, very passive, very calm, very quiet. They talk, they read, they're creative in terms of arts and crafts, baking and things like that. Whereas boys are socialized to be more rambunctious, to be outgoing and adventurous, risk-taking, to be more aggressive, to communicate more physically rather than verbally. And this can play into how teachers then see the class in front of them. So if you've got a class that's more boy heavy, you would perhaps treat that class and the students in those classes differently to a class that is more girl heavy, and then different again if you've got a more 50-50 split. But that gender role socialization and those gender role norms will shape how teachers will see students in front of them. The next one is social class. And with social class, it's not that teachers know your students' financial backgrounds or their family financial backgrounds, but there are certain things that can indicate class, and one of them is language codes. And Bernstein talks about the restricted and the elaborated codes. So the elaborate code, is associated with the middle classes. And the elaborate code refers to language that is wide in vocabulary, grammatically complex, varied and often abstract in nature, and is context free. You can understand what somebody is talking about without being given necessarily a lot of context. Whereas the restricted code is often associated with the working class, and that is more grammatically simple. Sentences are a lot shorter. It's very contextually bound. It tends to be very literal in the way that people with the restricted code tend to speak. And what Bernstein doesn't say is that one is the elaborate code is better than the restricted code. He doesn't say that, although it's kind of implied. What he says is that there is these different ways of speaking, and he points out that the elaborate code is the code of the education system, meaning that the way that schools are built, if you like, is around the elaborate code. The way textbooks are written, the way teachers speak, the way that the brochures and things like that are all written, tend to be towards the elaborate code. Now, this is probably because a lot of teachers are middle class, so that's a natural way for those people to speak. But because of that, it can create a label that perhaps the working class aren't as intelligent as the middle classes. And that's not to say that's true, or it may be that the working class might, or those with a restricted language code, can find it difficult to access education. And that doesn't mean that they're less intelligent, it just means that they take a little bit longer to process the information because it's not necessarily in a format that they would readily understand. Similarly to somebody whose English is perhaps a second language. It's not that they don't know the answers or they're not intelligent, they just might need that little bit more time to process and understand what's being said. So translating what's being said to them in order to be able to respond. But because people who are English native speakers, they're not necessarily given that processing time, and it can lead to the label of perhaps being less intelligent or less academically able. The next one we look at is ethnicity, and ethnicity, we will talk about this in a lot more detail later on, but it does link into the idea of institutional racism and unconscious bias. Now, when we're talking about unconscious bias, we're not talking about teachers who are outright racists and saying that all teachers are outright racists. We're not saying that at all. What we're saying is that stereotypes of certain ethnicities can lead to labelling, which can lead to differences in educational achievement. And these racial stereotypes, they are being broken down. They are being, and teachers and educational training establishments are training staff to be aware of their unconscious biases and to try and counter those, to be more neutral. And this is the same with labelling overall, is more and more teachers and educational training providers are teaching and talking about labelling in schools so that they can become less labelled. I can't think of another way of putting it. But so that if we're aware that we do this, then we can, when those labels perhaps are a little bit more negative, we can counteract that. And we can kind of go, no, okay, this is my unconscious bias, or this is a stereotype, a label that I'm attaching, and I need to stop doing that. Okay, if the label, but positive labeling can lead to positive outcomes, so possibly not all labeling. Okay, we also need to think about behavior in class. Now, this is one of the later elements which will come into the creation of the label, because obviously it's the interaction between the teacher and the student that will create this. So a student comes in, they're polite, they're respectful, they do the work, they're going to possibly be labeled more positively. Student comes in who's aggressive or behaving in a way that is not allowed in the classroom, that's against the process, the rules of the lesson, or refuses to do the work, is disruptive, etc. They're going to perhaps get a more negative label. So you can kind of see that as being a natural progression. The label that is attached to you is attached to the behaviour that you have demonstrated. Now, obviously, this in-class behaviour could link to other labels such as the social class, gender, or ethnicity, and some of the other factors we're going to talk about. But it's almost the, if you like, the cementing factor. We also talk about previous teachers. Now, as I said before, we don't sit around and formally put labels on you, but teachers do talk. We do talk to each other. If you move schools, reports are written to the new school to let them know what sort of student you are. And at the start of the year, when we get our registers and things like that, you kind of look through and you kind of see who you've got, and you might be talking to people and it's like, oh yeah, I had that person last year, they're absolutely brilliant, such a lovely person, so wonderful, did all their work, went above and beyond. Or they might be going, oh my god, they're such a nightmare. Oh god, they were disruptive, they were a pain in the backside. So we do talk as teachers, and even if it's not at the beginning of the year when we get our registers, there are certain names that people know, and which links into our next one, which is reputation. There are certain students where you say the name and people will know who you mean, even if they haven't taught them. And that could be an individual, where you kind of go, oh, so I had such and so today, and everyone, oh, they're so lovely, oh, they're so nice, I like them. Or it could be, oh my god, yeah, I know who you mean. And it can be more negative. But that reputation could also be linked to a family name. So sort of like you kind of see the name, the surname on the register, and you kind of go, I wonder if they're related to so-and-so. So you check the system and you kind of go, oh yeah, I know that family. And that, again, it can be positive, it can be negative. I mean, when I was at secondary school, a lot of my teachers taught my parents as well. They taught both my mum and my stepdad. And I imagine that they had ideas about who I was and what was coming into the school when I joined, because my older sister was already there, my aunts and uncles went to that school, my cousins went to that school. There's a reason I left the area. But that kind of reputation can also impact how a teacher interacts with a student, and it does work the other way around. We're not just, when we're talking about labeling, it's not just teachers on students, it could be the other way around as well. Teachers have reputations, and it's, you kind of go, oh, you look at your timetable at the beginning of the year and kind of, oh, I've got so and so for whatever subject. Oh, I had them last year, they're so horrible, they're so not, or oh, they're really lovely, they're really sweet, and they do nice things, and they're a really good teacher, and things like that. So the labeling can go both ways, especially with reputation. We do need to think about data as well, and the idea of how, because we do have data. We have your grades from previous years, we have reports that we can look at. We know if you've got special educational needs, not a phrase I like particularly, but if you have additional needs, if you've got, if perhaps you had a bad year for some external or extraneous reason. So the data also plays into it. So it's kind of like, oh, well, that student's predicted or targeted a low grade. So when they get a low grade on an assessment, yeah, well, they're still within their target. So, but whereas another student who perhaps is targeted a bit higher, they get a low grade. Well, what's going on here? Rather than it being kind of, okay, you've got your assessment grade and let's see where we go from here, that can change the experience. So all of these factors plus many more can create this label. Now Hargreaves talks about the stages of labeling, and so it doesn't just happen all in one go. He first talks about the first stage being speculation. So some of these factors such as gender, ethnicity, reputation, all of these things can formulate a speculative label. Then when you're in lessons, you've got the in-class behaviour, you've got the data, the kind of language code kind of thing, which is considered elaboration. So you've got speculation, then you've got elaboration, and then through more and more interaction with the student, between the student and the teacher, that creates what he referred to as stabilization. So there's a speculative label. In the elaboration phase, that can then change, or it can kind of reinforce the label that's been speculated on, and then through more and more interaction, we get this stabilization. So speculation, elaboration, stabilization is how the label is formed. Now Becker talks about the ideal pupil, and what he means by this is how, as teachers, we have an idea in our heads about the perfect student, what they look like, how they behave, what their academic ability is like, and it's almost like this ghost pupil, if you like. This, it lives in our heads, and all other students need to kind of live up to. And this can be given out to students in terms of, and I do this in sociology, it's kind of like, if you want to do well at sociology, these are the characteristics I'm looking for. I'm looking for somebody who engages in discussion. I'm looking for somebody who's curious about the world around them, somebody who is willing to read and apply their knowledge to the world around them, things like that. Those are, in my head, what makes the ideal sociology student. And this ideal pupil, this ideal student that lives in a teacher's head, or lives in my head, is the measuring stick by which we measure all other students by. And so if you're living up to that ideal pupil, you probably get a positive label. If you're not doing what is in my head as the ideal student, that could lead to a negative label. So it's almost like a guideline, if you like, of what am I looking for in students in my classroom. What am I looking for students to behave and to be academically inclined to, and that can again feed into the labelling and the attachment of labels to students in a classroom. Now this could be, again, as I said, it could be positive and it could be negative. So there have been lots of studies into labelling. As I said, it's now becoming more and more part of the teacher training program, CPD and things like that, as trying to identify this labelling process and maybe not necessarily counteract it because it is a human way of doing things, but more kind of be aware, have an awareness of it. So the first one was done by Ray Rist in the US, and what Ray Rist did was he went into a kindergarten school and he looked at how a teacher used home backgrounds to group or segregate students. And this particular school, they had the Tigers, who were neat, middle class, fast, academically able students. You then had the Cardinals, who were the middling students, some working class, some middle classes. They were okay. They're the kind of what is sometimes referred to as the gliders. They do what they need to do to get through. They don't excel, they don't underachieve, they just glide through the education system. And then you had the clownfish, who were troublesome students. They were the ones who were from poorer, working class, deprived backgrounds. They would be the ones that would perhaps come to school without equipment, poorly dressed, things like that. And what Rist found was he followed these students over a number of years through their kindergarten, primary education into their secondary, high school education. And he found that these labels that had been attached to them in pretty much their first year of school followed them throughout the rest of their education. And so those that were in the clownfish group were still labelled as troublesome, low academic achievers, even by the time they got to high school 10 years later, or 8 years later, or however long it was. And those who were Tigers had been pushed into advanced placement courses, which we don't have in the UK. They were student council, they were excelling within education. So we can see that those labels from very early on in your education can really impact your educational experience and your educational outcomes. The second study comes from Hempel Jorgensen. God, I love sociology names. And he pointed out that the ideal pupil varies not just between individual teachers, but also between types of school. And it varies depending on the social makeup of the school. So for example, in Aspen, the town in the US, in a working class school where discipline was a problem, the ideal pupil was quiet, passive and obedient. Whereas in another town not far away, which was called Rowan, which was more middle class, there were few disciplinary problems, so the ideal pupil here was defined by personality and academic ability rather than behaviour. So what we can see here is this determination of ideal pupil, which shapes the label that is attached, whether the label is positive or negative, can be different depending on the school that you look at. So for example, Wyndham College is quite middle class school. Although we are rural Norfolk, we're quite international, so we tend to see the ideal pupil as somebody who's engaged in Wyndham Life activities, somebody who is working hard, they're neat, they have equipment, they do extracurricular clubs, they're involved. And because of the boarding side of Wyndham College, we do very much push that kind of getting involved in wider school life. Whereas the school I worked at in London, which was quite a deprived school, where we did have a lot of behaviour problems, the ideal pupil in that school was, again, it was passive, quiet, not disruptive, quietly plodding along and getting through. Okay. That then brings us to kind of the idea of in-school groupings. Now, in-school groupings can be linked very much to labelling. They not only can be caused by labelling, but they can also create the label. So we've got another study here, which is Rosenthal and Jacobson, it was called Pygmalion in the Classroom. Now this is a classic study and ethically very dodgy. So what Rosenthal and Jacobson did, this was referred to as a field experiment. So if you need an example for a field experiment, this is the one. And what they did was they went into this school and they gave fake IQ tests to the students. So they looked real, and the students took them. And then what Rosenthal and Jacobson did was they randomized the students and picked 20% of them. And those students that completely random, picked out of a hat, well, computer program, were identified as bright students, the bloomers, they called them. And the bottom, another 10% was identified as the bottom half of the year. They didn't do very well on this IQ test. And Rosenthal and Jacobson told the school the results of this test, and then came back a year later, retested the students to see how the progress of these students over the course of the year, to see whether or not that label of bloomer or less able had actually impacted the education of those children. And this is why it's slightly unethical, because it does impact their education. Those students who were identified as being bloomers, as being the top 20%, made more progress than the other students, the middle group or the lower ability group. And those that were in the lower ability group tended to regress in terms of the testing. So they did the initial fake IQ test to begin with, came back a year later, retested the students to see what changes had made. Now, as I said, it is unethical, and it is unethical because it negatively impacted the education of some of those students. But what they also found out is that that data that was used also created in school groupings. Now, there are 4 ways that schools group students in schools. The first, and you've probably experienced some of these yourselves, the first is setting. And what happens in setting is within each subject area, you are in, say, top, middle and bottom. Okay, so you might be top English, middle maths, bottom French, middle science, top art, so on and so forth. Okay, so you're set according by ability within individual subjects. Now, this can be seen as a good thing, because it can mean that those who are more able can be stretched and those who are less able can be nurtured, and the middle group can be taught appropriately. However, as we've seen with labelling, that being told you're bottom set maths can have a negative impact, because in like, well, I can't do maths, I'm bottom set, I can't do it. So it can be both positive and negative. The next one is streaming, and this is where you're placed in ability groupings, but the same ability grouping for all subjects. So we used to have it here at the college where you were red, green or blue band. So red band were the top students, green band were the middle students, blue band were the lower ability students. And that would link to your GCSE subjects that you could take. It would link to what groupings you were in terms of sets and things like that. And it's similar to kind of impacts as setting. Now, a lot of schools have got rid of this because of the negative labelling attached to it. So we no longer have streaming. We do still have sets in certain subjects, but usually that is linked to exam papers that people are sitting. So for example, in science, we have the triple group, which is higher ability, and we have double award science, which is everybody else. It used to be you'd have foundation paper, intermediate paper and higher paper for certain GCSEs, and that would link to the sets and streams that you were placed in. You also have in-class groupings where teachers will put people in groups according to ability within their own classrooms. which again can mean that perhaps you give something a little bit more complicated or a little more difficult to those who are more able, compared to those who perhaps needed a little bit more support. But generally in education today, we see much more mixed ability teaching. So for example, it doesn't matter whether you're targeted a 9 at GCSE or an A star in A level or an E or a 1, you'd be in the same class. Now, for some people that is a good thing because it means that everybody is more equal opportunity education, but for others it can be seen as a negative. It can be seen as more work for teachers because they've got to differentiate more. They've got to scaffold it enough for the lower ability, but they've also got to stretch and challenge the higher ability. So it can be seen as a positive because the lower ability have got the higher ability to support, help them, and push them, and they're not seen as being lower ability and unable. But again, it could be that the lower ability perhaps sees the higher ability and kind of goes, well, I can't do that, so why am I bothering? Or the higher ability are being kept behind while the lower ability catch up. Now, I'm not a big fan of those phrases, but I'm using them because that's what the easiest way to describe it. Keddie did a study where he applied the idea of the speculative labelling to in-school groupings, and Keddie found that those students who were speculatively labelled as underachieving were put in lower streams and sets, and this then became self-fulfilling prophecy, which I'll talk about in a minute, because they were in lower streams and sets. They weren't given access to the knowledge necessary for them to achieve higher in education. They weren't given the opportunity to show what they could do. So the speculative labelling that we were talking about from Hargreaves showed in Keddie's study that those students who were speculatively labelled as low ability, probably based on data, prior reports, things like that, would then be put in lower sets and streams, which would then lead to educational underachievement. So I've already talked about this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. This is reactions to this is how people react to the label, and it can sometimes be forgotten that there is a process to the labelling. It's not a case of label attached, that's going to lead to that behaviour. So what we can talk about is linking back to Hargreaves' idea of speculation, elaboration, and whatever the third one was. You've got the teacher who speculates about the student and creates this picture in their mind of what the student is like, usually shaped by the ideal pupil that they have in their minds. When they meet that student, when they interact with that student, that label shapes that interaction and creates how the teacher interacts with that student. But then we get into what's called the negotiation phase. And it's not necessarily a case of just because you're treated a certain way, you're going to behave accordingly. Now that can happen, and that's what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. So the student accepts the label and internalizes it, creating a master status, which then they live up to. So they're labelled as high achieving, they kind of go, yeah, okay, I'm high achieving, yeah, that's all good. They internalise that, I'm a good student, I'm brilliant at whatever subject it is, and then they live up to that label. They act according to that label. Could obviously go the other way as well, where student is labelled as a troublemaker or as low ability. They kind of go, okay, that's what you think of me, that's what I'm going to do, and they internalise that and do that. But the negotiation phase can go the other way as well. It can go to the student turning around going, no, you think I'm like that, I'm going to prove you wrong. And this is a key study by Margaret Fuller, who looked at Afro-Caribbean girls in a London school who had been labelled negatively by teachers or by the education system, and they were just kind of like, yeah, no. And they weren't doing it to, they rejected the label and were almost kind of like, well, you think I can't do it? Well, watch me. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to achieve well. Showing that just because a label is attached doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stabilize. So that elaboration phase in Hargreaves' 3-step system is what we refer in self-fulfilling prophecy phase is what we call the negotiation phase. Which elements of that label are the students going to accept and internalize? Which ones are they going to reject and kind of do the opposite to, if you like? So a self-fulfilling prophecy isn't necessarily guaranteed. It all depends on how the student reacts to the label that they've been given. Now, if we have a look at this graphic, we can kind of see how it might link, how it can link into educational achievement and experiences of school. So positively labelled student A, they're hardworking, they're focused, they're engaged, they're doing everything they're supposed to do. Because of that, they join a pro-school subculture. We're going to talk about subcultures in the next lecture, but they're the kind of ones who are accepting of school rules. They get their status from doing well in school, be it academically, be it in the wider community of the school through school councils and things like that. They are given high expectations in terms of their behaviour. They're put into higher sets and streams. They develop a studious intellectual self-concept. I am a good student. I need to prove myself as a good student. I need to maintain that good student role. And that can lead to high grades in any external exams, whether that be GCSEs or A-levels. Now, student B, who's been negatively labelled as lazy, less able, distractive, troublesome, develops a their concept around non-school activities. So they're achieving status through things outside of school. The school has low expectations of them. So instead of you can get top grades, you can do really well. So okay, you got a 4. That's good for you. That's a good grade for you. And I really hate that phrase. And they tend to join retreatist or intransient subcultures, or an anti-school subculture, where it's kind of like, I can't get status, kudos or whatever through academic achievement or through school activities, so I'm going to get it by being the class clown, by being a bully, by being disruptive and those sort of behaviours. And that can lead to middling, averaging or low GCSE grades, because they don't see their status linked to their educational achievement. Their status comes from other parts of their life, whereas student A is getting their status through that academic achievement, through their collegiate achievements. So what we can see here is that the labelling process, and which links to the in-class grouping process, can create an experience of the education system that could be fantastic. It could be negative, and that experience and that label can also link into whether a student does well in school or whether they do not so well in school. But it's not guaranteed, and that's the thing I need you to remember, is it's not guaranteed. Students can accept the labels that are attached to them, they can reject them. These labels are not fixed, they are constantly negotiated and renegotiated. So think the reflexive self from Giddings. Okay, so roles and processes in schools. We talked about the ideal pupil and Becker's idea of the ideal pupil. There is the generic, view of the ideal pupil, but each teacher will have in their minds the ideal pupil for their own students as well. The different ways that students are grouped in school: setting, streaming, in class, and mixed ability. We attach labelling theory to education, talking about how there's the speculative label, which is elaborated on, and then you have the negotiation phase as to whether that label is stabilized and internalized, or whether it's rejected and possibly reformatted. Okay, and we've got those key studies from Rosenthal and Jacobson, Rist, Jorgensen and Keddy, which kind of reinforce those ideas.